Hey everyone, welcome to Dave's Bonsai. On today's episode, I just need this chopstick to complete the task for the day. I'm sitting in the shade at the upper pond of my garden, looking at the goldfish, enjoying the warm weather. Right now, at last check, 93 degrees here in Minnesota, in my neck of the woods, and it feels like 97. Now, earlier reports were going to say 97, 98 for the actual temp, and with the dew point, the humidity, it would feel like 103, 104. Pretty hot. I woke up this morning, I was going to go on a run, but the dew point already was 71. The dew point, 71, and it was 76 degrees at 8 o'clock this morning. So instead of a run, I just took a walk. So we really have to consider the heat with our bonsai trees, and we have to consider it in a couple different ways. And so today, I'm just going to do the thing that I preach at a lot of the workshops I teach at the Minnesota Bonsai Society. I talk about with new folks to the club, and it's really how do we water our trees? And we have to be careful with the watering, right? We don't want to water some of the trees too much. We don't want to water them too little. And with a day like today, we really have to keep a close eye on our trees. Now, I'm a teacher, and so it is now summer break. So when we hit these high temperatures, I can check my trees multiple times a day and make sure they're doing okay. But not everybody has that luxury. So a couple of things to keep in mind. If you can't be home to water your trees, make sure you put them in a shaded area. So this part of my garden gets shade most of the day after it hits about 11, 12 o'clock. The sun is straight up. I got the ash tree that shades this part of my garden, and the trees are happy, though be it warm, not scorched by the sun as much. And so that'll help with drying out, whether it's a dry heat or a humid heat. Now the other thing we have to consider when we water our trees is what kind of pot is it in? You know, is it a ceramic pot? Is it a plastic pot? Is it a real thin pot? Is it a thicker pot? Is it a deep pot? Is it a shallow pot? We also have to consider the soil that's in there. Do we have larger soil? Remember, the larger the soil, the more drainage. It's going to drain right through, and it's going to dry out quicker as well. However, if it's a big pot with a lot of big soil, that's going to dry out slower than the pot that's shallower with big soil in it. Then, of course, if you have fine soil or the smaller soil in a shallow pot, that's going to dry out faster than a lot of small soil in a bigger pot. And the finer soil is going to hold that moisture a lot more than the bigger soil particles. So keep all of that in mind when you're watering. But one of the best things you can do if you really don't know what your soil is going to do is to use the trusty chopstick. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to walk around and I'm going to grab a couple of trees or put the camera by a couple of trees, and we're just going to give it the old chopstick test. Because we're going to dig down. Sometimes my fingers are too big and it would just make a mess. So I'm going to dig down with a chopstick and I'm going to see how moist the soil is. So not just at the surface, because that's going to dry out from the sun and all the wind today, but it's also humid today, so it might not dry out quite as fast. But then down low, it still might be wet. So I don't want to water some of these trees if it's really humid out here and it's still wet down below, because then they're just going to be sitting in this really warm, moisture. One of the things we have to remember when we do check our bonsai pots and why we check this and water them during the heat, we don't water them so much to give drink for the tree to soak up that moisture and keep growing. A lot of times in the heat of summer in some parts of the country, some people believe some of the trees go into somewhat of a dormancy stage. Other parts of the country, people don't say that happens at all, and it's just the trees keep growing all the way through summer. But when it gets hot, what we're really concerned about is the roots of those trees. So again, if you have a deep pot with little soil, a small size soil in there, that's going to stay wet longer. And we need the moisture to keep the roots cool. If those roots get super, super hot, that's going to cause as much, if not more damage than just the sun on our leaves. Sure, we might get some leaf scorch from time to time, but we need to really cool off those roots. So let's take a peek at a couple of trees in the garden here of Dave's Bonsai, and let's see if we need to water these for a second time today, because they were watered at about 9 o'clock this morning. Now my first test is going to be with the workshop trees, because I want to make sure that they're healthy and staying good and moist. Now I watered these at 9 o'clock, and now it is coming up on about 2 o'clock. So we're only talking 5 hours later. And because these are in the shade, you'll notice that there's a darker color to the soil, and just by my fingers, I can tell that this soil is pretty moist still. And as if I take my chopstick here, and I go down deeper into the soil, yeah, there's plenty of moisture in there. You can see the dark color that it is, and that's tested, that's done. All of these trees up here are just fine. They're not in direct sun right now. A little indirect sun coming through the leaves, but they're fine. We can move on to the next tree. The next tree I want to show you is one of my Japanese maples. So my Japanese maple here is in a very shallow pot. So if I lift up the pot, you can see with my thumb and finger here, this is only about an inch or so, inch and a half deep. Not a very deep pot. Now, this also, just by looking at it, shows a pot that looks pretty moist. And if I just go like this with my fingers, yeah, there's plenty of moisture in here. But just to show, look at that. Yeah, so it's 93 degrees outside, but because this is mainly in the shade, you can tell just by the surface it's not too bad. And as I dug down just a little bit, definitely a lot of moisture in that pot, even though it's nice and shallow. So the trees along this line will be fine for a while as well. The next two trees I want to show you, just for some comparison, is I've got a little ceramic pot that's about a 5 by 7 and about 2 inches deep. And then I've got about a 15 by 9 big pot that I have this big Siberian fir in. And this one looks dry. Now this one's been more in the sun today, as well as this one. But we have two different size pots here. Now if I just take the chopstick and I peel back just a little bit, there's still, that soil is very, very moist, and that's doing just fine. So that one's okay. This one looks a lot drier. You can tell up top it's just much more dry. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to go down lower into the soil here. And as I go lower into the soil here, these particles of bonsai soil are still moist. They're not dry at all compared to how dry the top looks. So you don't have to do this with every single tree in your garden. But when you check a tree in this part of my garden, and I have other pots in this size, I know that it's going to be about the same dryness. So check out the small ones, check out the big ones, and make sure that you're not overwatering your trees. Now this one might be getting warm with the heat of today, but it's still moist in there, so it'll keep it a little cooler for longer. We might get till the evening with this one, even if we water at all. So now we're at the big bench, and this bench is pretty much full sun all day long. And so this is the bench that I have to be very, very careful with. But let's take a look. I've got a huge pot here that's about 14 by 20 right here. Huge pot. That one's going to take a lot longer to dry off than, say, this little shallow tray right here. But as I look at this shallow tray right here, I dig back some soil, it's already a darker color right here, and as I stick my finger in there, there's still moisture in there in this super shallow pot. So this one is doing just fine. Now this one at its surface looks incredibly dry, and it's a very dark pot. So that's going to soak up more of that sun, and it's really lightweight. So this one concerns me a little bit more. So, as I dig in this one, the soil is just kind of loose. It's a bigger soil than was in that smaller one, and it's pretty lightweight, the pot. And as I stick my finger down here, there is a little bit of moisture in here, but this is the driest one we've felt so far. This pot is going to need watering first before anything else I've seen today. And I have another similar one right here. And these are with some willows that are really dying and looking pretty weepy. There's growth on them, but they're not looking so healthy. Now the sphagnum moss on top of here is still a little wet, and inside here it's a little wet as well. This one's not as bad. If I come over here, I can take some weeds out, and just by weeding this, when I lift up these weeds, I already can see darker soil over here. So this dark soil, and when I feel it after I weed this one is plenty moist, get through the rest of today probably just fine. And you'll also notice it's a much larger pot than the previous two I just picked up. So I'll go ahead and weed the rest of these out of here. We don't want the weeds taking up all that moisture either. Get that weed out of there, pull some of those weeds out. And the viburnum here can continue in this nice pot. Now up here we have the Marquette grape. Bigger soil. I put bigger soil in here. And as I peel back some soil, middle of the road, very big coarse soil, it's draining a lot faster. If I come by and water this, I definitely would give this another quick little squirt because it's getting warm in here. It's very warm at the bottom. This is a black Anderson flat, and this is warming up very fast. I probably should cool down these roots along with this. I have a couple more shallow ones up here. I have my Kishu Shimpaku up here with bigger coarse soil. So as I bring out the Kishu and I dig in there, yeah, we have some nice darker soil here. It feels good and moist. I do not want to overwater my Kishu. So that one goes back to the top, and that one's fine. As we come over to this side, I've got my small Marquette grape, which is doing really nice. Smaller soil, and this one feels a little dry. Smaller soil, smaller pot, but it's still got a little moisture in here, but this one is starting to dry out as well. And I would assume these two in these tiny pots are dry as well. And as I look back at some of the soil here, this one is actually more moist than I anticipated. That one's looking pretty darn good. This one feels not as light as I was expecting. As I look down into the soil here, that one's going to be okay for a little while as well. Now the big guy over here. As I disturb some of the soil in the back here, yeah, a big pot, a lot of soil, 3 inches deep, 20 wide, maybe 12 deep. That one is doing just fine. So all of the stuff on the bench has been checked there. We should be in pretty good shape. So over by the fish pond, I had checked the trees over there, the tropicals. Now these are in full sun all day long, so they might be a little bit drier. And as I pick one up for you, you can tell it's already lighter color than those first ones we saw over there. And as I dig into the soil, not too bad. There's still moisture in there. That top layer was really dry looking, but when you get down here, it's a little bit darker from what I dug up. These are just fine for the rest of today, most likely. They probably can survive until tomorrow. And now tomorrow is going to be a much colder day, only a high in the low 70s. I'll water in the morning and they'll be totally fine for the rest of the day. So these might be fine without watering for today as well. One of my final stops for today is up on my porch, which gets a lot of sun throughout the day, is a lot of my succulents, and I have all my PAs. So the Portulacaria afra is a plant that you don't need to water as much because if you water too much, you get the root rot, and you don't want that. But on a hot day like this again today, it's super dry. And as I go down this little pot right here, there is hardly any moisture in here whatsoever. So this pot and this pot, very, very dry. This is another one of those shallow pots. And let's get into this side right over here. This looks like it has a little more moisture. It's retaining more moisture than this. It's a bigger pot, so the middle is probably more moist. These have smaller pot, more sides to heat up and dry out that soil. This one looks okay. And because it's a Portulacaria afra, I'm going to leave this alone, and I probably can leave this alone too, because all the moisture in these in the foliage is going to keep these trees fine for the rest of today. And last up on the porch anyway, I have a couple of ficus. So I have my variegated benjamina, Ficus benjamina, and I have another melon seed ficus that is sitting up on top here with a little bit finer soil than this guy over here. This is a Premna. So this Premna tropical, it had a little accident, and I put some new soil in on the top, and look at how dry and look at how loose this soil is. Very free draining soil. This has some sphagnum moss on top. You can see how solid this is. And this over here has been in the pot for a couple of years, so it's more solid than this loose right here. This is going to drain soil a lot faster than this. It's going to go right through this size. This is going to stick around. The sphagnum moss is going to hold it in, and this has also been in this pot for a while, so it's going to hold it in here as well. And when I peel back this soil, sure enough, this is pretty moist soil, considering. It looks dry as a bone on top, but it's pretty moist. This one, on the other hand, is super dry right here. But if I go down to the lower soil, a little bit of moisture. But this one might be the one of all of them that I would water because it's such big soil. Now this one over here that you can't see, it was off camera, is another one of my jade plants, super tiny cutting. Very dry soil up here. This is a fertilizer that is spread out. Super dry soil. You can see how loose the granules are here too, free draining. But again, this is a succulent type tree, right? This jade does not need to be watered today. We'll get it tomorrow. It's going to just do fine in the dry temperature, high heat, and we'll get it moist tomorrow. So there is the porch plants. I have 2 Amur maples that are in these great big crates that I made. And again, I can pull out the weeds and see if there's any moisture on the weeds. And they look a little moist. They didn't get too deep though. I watered this one good today, but this has bigger soil in it, and so it's going to probably be a lot of free drainage in here. But it's also a very big pot with a lot of soil in here. And as you dig down this soil, you can already see the color changes just ever so slightly. There's moisture clinging to those rocks. It is dry and as loose as it seems up here upon first touch and glance. It is still moist inside, and again, we're between 2 and 2:30 in the afternoon after a 9 o'clock watering on a 93-degree day, but the humidity is so high in the dew point, this tree will be fine for the rest of the day as well. As you can see, the chopstick, my finger, the eyes, it's all you really need. Lift up your pots. If they're really light, they're probably dry, but sometimes you do have to just dig right in. We finish up today with all of the larch plantings that I did a couple weeks back. They're still in this part shade, part sun spot. They're growing very, very nice. We have lots of foliage on here. And so we're just going to go ahead and dig into one of these. I can already tell just by looking at them that the sphagnum moss is dark in color and it's just fine. And I can feel with my hands that that's moist. I do not probably have to go any further. And as I do go further, yeah, super, super moist. These are just fine for the rest of today. So that's all you have to do. You have to pay attention to your trees. And you have to know, how big is the pot? How big is your soil? How long has it been since you watered last? You know, you got to check them pretty often. How hot is it? How humid is it? Is the wind still blowing? And as dry as they look on top, they might not be dry below. And as wet as they are on top, they could be drier below if you have a really dark pot that's heated up from the outside and all the sides. If you have a lot of sphagnum moss on top, maybe this inside dried faster. So many factors, right? So take a peek at your trees, get yourself a good chopstick that you're going to be able to dig into the soil and see if you need watering. Remember, let's get those roots cooled off. We're not watering the tree so much to water the tree for thirst sake, for the leaves, foliage, and all the cells going up and down, as much as we're kind of producing a little refrigeration and cooling of the roots. So good luck with your trees, good luck with your watering. Hey, take care of you, take care of your bonsai, and we'll catch you very soon.